Hello, everyone. I wanted to just do a hopefully brief video on a particular aspect of the course, which I'm sure I cover in the videos that I've posted for Landsberg, but I wanted to emphasize. To put things in context, we are going through a part of the course that examines the possibilities of life after death. And in doing that, we are reading two philosophers who give us a view that there is such a thing, sort of departing from the Epicurean view that we had been working with before. So I think it's important to see that Plato and Landsberg are philosophers who believe in that, who deny the notion, the basically Epicurean notion, that at death the human person becomes nothing. They both are arguing that the human person remains a something through and beyond death. So it is important, of course, to note that they have that agreement. But it is also very important to note that Landsberg Landsberg's not a Platonist. Landsberg is a Christian of a certain sort who wants to distinguish himself from Plato insofar as how he conceives of life after death, survival of death. And I'm looking at what I consider to be the key passage in which that distinction is made. It's on page 214, towards the bottom. I just want to emphasize this. This is an important part of the thing. Sorry, I had to pause there. But if we look at this passage, it starts out with a very important theme of Landsberg, and that is the fear of isolation, the idea that the terribleness of death consists in the threat of isolation. The isolation of the individual, cutting off the individual from a community. And what he goes on to talk about is the idea of a world, right? That if we think of the dead continuing to live, they have to have a world to live in. As he says down here, thus the specter, the idea of the dead as a ghostly presence, the specter remains in a dubious relationship to the world to which it no longer belongs. That's the threat of isolation, the idea that he doesn't literally believe in ghosts. He's talking about the way that we imagine the dead as being somehow exiled from the world. That if we're going to have a notion of the afterlife, we have to have a notion of the kind of world that the dead live in. And Plato has a kind of a notion of that. He says, thus the Platonic attitude to death is only possible if one admits the ontology of ideas, that is, the Platonic ideas, the idea that the Socratic idea that the philosopher goes on to commune with truth, to commune with the ideas. But then Landsberg says something very important. He says, but this also introduces us to the essential limitations of Platonism. That's the key point where he's criticizing Plato's notion of an afterlife. The spiritual world with which the spirit of the dead man will now coexist, in which it will participate by taking on the form of existence proper to this new world, is still only a world of ideas. Is the person itself to become an idea? Right? His conception or his criticism of Plato's conception of the afterlife is that it's not really a life. That the person, the dead person who moves into this world, is not really a person. But he's asking, is the person itself to become an idea? Now, the idea of the person is so important to Landsberg. The idea of the individual, unique person can't merge into an idea. That would not be a notion of the afterlife that Landsberg, or from his point of view, any Christian would be satisfied with. He continues, this spirit person would then be a transitory and secondary form of the spirit, which in its own essence would be idea. Here we are confronted with an antinomy, a problem. Antinomy is a problem of logic. For man's survival must be personal if it is to be survival, the survival that his hope leads him to seek, the soul survival worthy of the name. That is, what is the problem with Plato's notion of the afterlife? It does not make room for the personal, for the person. On the other hand, the ontology of ideas themselves is inevitably obscure unless they are understood to be secondary forms of the spirit, as it were, products of a person. The person has to be primary. It can't be the idea. The world brought to us by the ancient philosophers is not a world of neighbors. This notion of love, the Christian love, that the threat of death is separation. So the overcoming of death has to be communion, right? Neighbors, other persons. A world shaped by caritas, love. It is, above all, a world of things. That is, the world of Plato's notion of the afterlife is a simple world of things, a world of things seen. And even men are such things, public, limited beings. The transcendental world reflects the character of the empirical world. It is like the world of ideas, which are things seen by the spirit, and not like the world of persons. Well, that's his criticism, right? And then he enlarges upon this in the beginning of the next paragraph. The ontology of ideas is still dependent on the ontology of nature. It has not yet reached the full clarity of categories of mind. This is not a criticism of Plato's doctrines, but it is impossible not to perceive the limits of his experience. The philosopher seems to have been acutely aware of this himself, and appears for this reason to have left unsolved the difficulties created by the interpretation of the existence of the world of ideas. His limitations, Plato's limitations, right, are the limitations of all pre-Christian philosophers in Europe. Well, what is the limitation? Well, he says, the person was not yet disclosed, and the sense of death remained hidden. Well, that's quite an amazing criticism, I would say. And from the point of view of the Christian, perhaps the only view of ancient philosophy is a great philosopher like Plato can reveal so much, but he has his limits because he lived and thought of things in a world before Christ. That's the Christian idea. And for Landsberg, the big difference is that Plato's notion of the afterlife is impersonal. It's almost as if the philosopher becomes an idea rather than remaining himself. And that's the fatal flaw in Plato's vision of the afterlife. It's not what he says, the survival worthy of the name. Survival worthy of name would be survival of the person, the unique individual personality through and into death, beyond death, not the merging of the person into some generic oneness or experience of truth. It has to be a persistence of the unique individuality of the person to be survival worthy of the name. I just wanted to emphasize this point. I don't remember if I emphasized it to my satisfaction in the videos that I put up, but this is an incredibly important part of this part of the course, is seeing how Landsberg distinguishes himself from Plato.